Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. This week's story is one of my own, and it's a shameless plug for the Kickstarter I launched this morning. If you've been listening for any length of time, by now you know I have an epic fantasy series called The Half-Light Chronicles, featuring a world divided by magical barriers and filled with ancient artifacts, prophecies, and found family. In honor of today being my birthday, I'm launching the third book in the series on Kickstarter, so I'm sharing a short story from the world with all of you. Chronologically, it takes place around the middle of Book 2, and it highlights elements of Book 2 that I intentionally left a bit mysterious, but it can be read at any time. I chose to flesh this story out because I had so many requests for more from this small part of my world, where people can grow fins and scales to live in the water. It's narrated by my brother, Paeter Frandsen, host of Christian Geek Central. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to get a little more info about the Kickstarter as well as how to find Paeter's audio dramas and podcast. For now, please enjoy The Light That Glimmers by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 1. Gellin swam through the deep water, his eye on the brilliant amethyst edge of the coral cove. At the corner of his vision, an aqua fin flicked past, startling him out of his determined focus. He narrowed his eyes and pumped the fins of his arms and the dark green tail extending from his fused legs faster. Accepting Nori's unspoken challenge, his muscles hummed from consistent excursions to the coral cove, and he easily passed her dainty fins and scales. It wasn't her fault she was stuck on land with her parents in Tideholm most days, but he still turned around to swim backward, waving triumphantly at her. She scowled, but there was a fire in her eyes that let him know she enjoyed their wordless banter. He flashed a few signs in water words, asking if she wanted to admit defeat now. He knew she never would, but it was fun to watch her lips purse and her scales darken in irritation. He let her catch up enough so that he could wrap his scaled hands around her wrist. If he was willing to invade her privacy, he could tune in to her thoughts with his noetic magic at any time, but pushing his thoughts into her mind required touch. The sooner we get there, the sooner I have to work. She shook off his hand and signed back. Isn't that what you want? You'd rather spend time with the gemstones than people. Then she raced past him once more, her tail a shimmer of light in the water's depths. He sighed and let her go. Her hot and cold responses always left him confused, wishing there was a way to be the man she wanted while still fulfilling his role as guardian. He cared for the gemstones because he cared for the people, but Nori never seemed to understand that. Both sets of parents expected them to marry whether or not she came around to wanting it in her heart. The open-ended proposal was simply waiting for her agreement, but he didn't want her to say yes unless she meant it. If she couldn't even stand sharing thoughts with him when their words couldn't carry across the water, he still had a long way to go to win her over. She turned, and when she saw he'd stopped swimming, frustration sped up her hand motions. Are you just going to let me win? He shook his head, but he didn't resume racing her either. Bubbles escaped her lips as she heaved out a sigh and waited for him. Her hands moved once more. Nothing exciting ever happens on Selah Island. Even the depths of Palin's waters don't hold my interest the way they did when I was young. He sighed back. Especially when you're stuck with me. She rolled her eyes. Exactly. He longed to hear the tone in her voice, and to have her hear his in return, but he didn't dare stretch his hand out for hers again. Did she agree because she found truth in his words, or did she tease him because his words were false? They resumed swimming side by side, taking a more leisurely route through the water. What about when the pods of whales came through? He signed. And we convinced half our friends they wanted us to join them in a traveling performance troupe. Her smile returned, bringing him back to their younger years when they'd explored the sea together. Had she stopped smiling because he'd become guardian? Or had becoming guardian made him stop doing and saying the things that made her smile? Your somersault act with the baby orca was quite convincing. Nori could barely finish signing the words as she doubled over in silent laughter, bubbles rising from her lips once more. Gellin stuck his tongue out at her, but he didn't really mind. Not when the memory made things easier between them again. Where do you suppose those whales are now? Nori signed. Across the barrier? Gellin shook his head. Impossible. Nori's smile fell, replaced by stubborn determination as she lifted her chin. I want to cross the barrier someday, like Aunt Rhodocepha. It wasn't the first time she'd expressed the desire, but each time it came up, it made Gellin more uneasy. Long ago, the stars had divided all of Riston to separate the fighting people groups. The sprites had gathered the Salines on their island to protect them from the humans and half-lights. They were safe here, far away from the other groups who wanted them dead. Why would she want to do something so dangerous? The star bridge that could give you passage across the barrier was likely lost with your aunt. Signing the words felt insensitive but necessary. Nori chewed on her lip while they swam. Then I want to go see Lady Marinia. Gellin stiffened, but tried not to let his concern show. Going to the seer was dangerous. Those who did often came away changed. Surely she wasn't desperate enough for that. He chose his words carefully before signing. You can only visit the seer once in your life. Your mother thinks you should wait until you've had more time to consider what you might ask. He could practically feel the heat of Nori's frustration boiling the water around them as she signed, Of course that's what my mother wants. She would do anything to keep me safe, even if it means keeping me from living. For once, Gellin was grateful his hands weren't wrapped around her wrist and that she couldn't hear his thoughts, which centered around secrets her mother had told him. Aquana wanted Nori and Gellin to wed for the sake of the people, the same as she and her husband and Gellin's parents. It would solidify a future elder and wife from solid homes of the current elders. But there was more to it than that for Nori's mother, who'd made her own desperate visit to the seer years ago. According to Aquana, Nori's future existence depended on them getting married. Saving Nori's life was reason enough for Gellin to follow through on the arrangement, but he wanted it to be so much more. Deciding to try a different tactic, he signed to Nori once more. Serventa just returned a few weeks ago, and she can no longer stand the sight of the gemstones the coral gifts our people. What if you come away with your mind as deranged as hers? That's different. Nori made a face, then swam ahead, effectively cutting off their ability to finish the conversation. He caught up to her, not willing to let the subject drop. He grabbed her wrist once more, letting his thoughts drift through to hers. Maybe more interesting things would happen if you were willing to consider my offer. She scoffed, but didn't pull away. The scales of her cheeks shifted from blue to orange. Tuning in to her thoughts gave him access to so much more than her words. Fear mixed with anger fueled the heat in her tone. Things like babies and elder obligations? Things that mean we can never leave or explore? No. He tugged her hand, forcing her to stop, and her eyes met his. Things like freedom. Uncertainty flickered across her face, but she didn't argue. Your parents might not let you roam the sea, but as my wife, you would be free to explore. I would be free to go with you. We could find our own adventures in the sea. We could find our own excitement. We could find love. She jerked her hand away. He hadn't meant to let that last thought cross, and her rejection doubled his mortification. The thought hadn't always been so alarming to her, not when they'd been younger. In fact, she'd shown interest in him long before he'd returned the feelings, but his responsibilities seemed to put a wall between them, or maybe it was the secrets he was forced to keep. Her seagrass green strands of hair swirled with the deep purple of his, their kelp-like consistency hemming them in a tiny circle for just the two of them. As they studied each other, something in her face softened, but then a dolphin whistle startled them both, breaking the intensity that held them so still. A few saline floated near the edge of the Coral Cove's archway entrance, reminding Gellin that they wouldn't be alone for long. "Promise me you'll think about it," he signed. Before she could respond, Relafin swam up beside them, his path jerky with agitation. The panic on his face was not nearly as alarming as the indecision on Nori's. The coral harvester was prone to overdramatizing the woes of caring for the coral, and since he reported to Gellin, it was Gellin's job to discern which of his concerns actually required intervention. "Guardian, you need to come see," Relafin began signing, then cut off as he glanced at Nori. Despite being an elder's daughter and possibly intended for the Guardian, she wasn't privy to updates on the coral. She wasn't a protector. The secrets Gellin had to keep always sat between them, making him wonder if that was the true reason she could never fully consider him. Relafin resumed signing. "There's something urgent you need to see." Without waiting for a response, the erratic saline swam around the cove's coral border, knowing Gellin would follow him to the breeding and gardening areas beyond the coral cove's walls. The water felt thick with Nori's judgment, but this was his job, his duty, not just as a future elder, but as a protector of the people, a protector of the coral. He shrugged sheepishly and signed once more to Nori. "See, life with me could be interesting." She narrowed her eyes. "I'm going to find the children in the cove," she signed. "At least they want to play games instead of always to work." Her eyebrows rose with a finality that made Gellin's heart sink. He'd lost any ground he'd gained in the last few moments. "You knew I had to come here for work," he signed. "I'll still find you when I'm done, and we can swim back together." "My parents only gave me 1 hour." She swam off, flipping her fin so close to his face she might as well have smacked him. When she slowed under the archway, Gellin hesitated, wondering if this was one of those times when a woman wanted to be chased. In the end, the weight of expectations drove him to follow the trail of the coral harvester instead. Chapter 2. The center of the coral cove was a haven for the salines, a place for the weary to rest and for the elderly to retire, a place for young families to take a break from their daily burdens, and a place for young salines to learn to hold their scales and gills at length. The coral created a protective atoll fence for the salines, and in return, the salines protected the coral. But the space south of the cove, the space where Gellin now swam, was forbidden for those not charged with specific protection roles. It was here that the coral was bred, gardened, and harvested. The young coral was kept safe, then transplanted to areas damaged in and around the cove. And out of thanks for the salines' protection, the coral produced gemstones for the people. The protectors were the only ones allowed in this area just outside the cove, both to protect the young coral and to ensure the coral felt safe enough to continue gifting gemstones to the salines, and also to keep the gemstones' secrets safe. As the oldest son of the eldest elder, it fell to Gellin to manage the harvest. Being the guardian was a responsibility he'd earned and wanted, but one that came at a great cost. Not just the burden that weighed him down, but the price of Nori, who didn't want to be tied down to Tideholm or the Coral Cove. When they were younger, he'd been able to play the same as her, seeking adventure on every horizon, but ever since he'd been gifted the magic of a starlock and named guardian of the coral, he'd had to choose duty over his heart. "Come," the other man signed once Gellin caught up, directing him toward the farthest bed of coral, the youngest of the planted reefs, coral not yet producing gemstones. On the way, they passed several mature reefs, the coral's fingers offering up shimmering gemstones with their multifaceted surfaces and rainbow shades. He wished he could bring Nori here to show her so much beauty in one place. Before they reached their destination, Gellin saw what had the man so upset, and his own blood grew cold with fear. The coral that had once lived and breathed the water they swam in now lay scattered in pieces, shattered without care or thought to its feelings. Only 6 pieces were large enough to replant and salvage. "How did this happen?" Gellin signed, his motions slow with his shock. He tore his gaze away from the decimation to see the other man's water words. "We're not sure. The night watch saw no signs of disturbance, so we suspect it occurred during the changing of the guard. But in this early stage, we do little to tend the coral, giving it the space it needs, so the damage wasn't noticed until just now. It could have been animals, or it could have been our own people." "No." Gellin slashed his hand firmly in front of him and spoke the word in his anger, even though his vocal cords were useless under the water. He paused, letting his anger cool before signing, "No other crops were affected?" Relafin shook his head, but his face still held misery. That coral wouldn't produce gemstones for another year or two, but losing it would still disrupt their production, and disrupting production would kill people. Maybe not right away, but it was the gemstones that kept them young and strong, prolonging their lives beyond that of humans and half-lights, the people across the barriers who were tied to land and unable to bond with the sea. It was the reason his parents had been able to have a new baby this year, even though they were among the oldest in Tideholm. It was the reason their small people group hadn't completely died out without resources from across the barriers. Without a new crop, they would need to ration the gemstones they had. Some of the eldest would have to sacrifice some of their final years. Some of the youngest would have to age too quickly. Others in their prime would have to accept the aching limbs and weary bones that come with old age. Barely a year into his role as guardian, and he was failing both the coral and the people. "And no other rows of reefs were affected?" he signed. Relafin hesitated. "No other coral was damaged," he signed. But then he swam over to the bordering coral bed and gestured at their fingers. They no longer stretched out to the sun and the water's surface, but curled in on themselves in a protective measure. In turn, the gemstones produced by the rows of coral surrounding the destroyed crops were no longer being offered by the coral to the people. A shiver ran down Gellin's spine. The gift from the coral was something they'd come to expect, but it was never truly a guarantee. If it wasn't the Salene's own entitlement bringing them to this point, they should at least consider this a reminder not to take the gift for granted. "This is why I wonder if it could be one of our own," Relafin signed, unable to hold Gellin's gaze. "Does the coral blame us?" The accusation was almost treacherous. To consider that one of their people could endanger all of the Salenes in this way. Surely the coral now protected themselves from whatever animals had attacked their neighboring branches. It wasn't a warning that future gifts would be withheld, was it? If Gellin gave in to his fears, he could command Relafin to harvest all the remaining gemstones before the coral could hide any more away, but even that rash action would be more likely to make the coral stop producing them altogether. "I'll ask Eiley to keep watch along with the guard," Gellin signed. Relafin nodded. "In the meantime, restore what you can and send extra healers to comfort the surrounding coral. Make sure it knows we're here to protect it, even though we may have failed in this instance." As Relafin swam off to do his bidding, Gellin clenched his jaw and surveyed the damage once more. He wouldn't be able to return to Tideholm with Nori, not until this investigation was complete. It would be one more thing for her to hold against him because he couldn't even explain the danger, not when the Guardian, Protectors, and Elders were sworn to secrecy about the details surrounding the gemstones. He didn't have to swim far to find the pod of dolphins. A quick circle and flip of his fin drew their attention, and within moments, one pulled away from her friends to brush against Gellin's side. He placed a hand on her nose, rubbing it affectionately before letting his palm rest near her fin. He did his best to slow down his thoughts, since it always helped when she did the same. She was the only dolphin with which he'd managed this method of communication, ensuring the Salenes could work with the creatures in peace. The playful things weren't often dangerous, but having Eiley on his side removed any last concerns he had about their kind. As he told her about the destroyed coral, tension rippled through her body in dismay. "Only shark," her words carried through his mind more like images imprinting on his brain. "No sharks here. Could it be a kraken or a sick whale?" Eily cocked her head in thought, the intelligence in her eyes always startling him. I watch. I learn. He rubbed her nose once more in appreciation. Thank you. This time he signed the words, and she nudged his hands with her nose. Nori's hour in the Coral Cove was nearly up, so Gellin returned to the archway, keeping an eye out for Nori. He let a rare smile cross his lips at the sight of the people enjoying their lives amongst the sea life. This was why he took care of the coral and gemstones. This was why he took his role so seriously. And whether Nori understood it or not, he did it as much for her as for the people. He wanted this safety for her and for the children they could have. Bubbles brushed past him, along with the familiar blue fin. Tiny salines with their scales half-formed and their fins all still split in two legs swam past him, chasing the woman he had come to find. Her scales were lighter, brighter, almost glittering, as if the sun's brightest light could reach the depths of these waters. She shimmered with the beauty and light of a gemstone. She rarely looked this way with him, so at ease, with so much joy. He watched her get caught by the children and then chase them in return. Two others sat in their safety suits, not yet able to control their transformation between skin and air breathing with scales and water breathing. They watched almost as longingly as he did. They desired the freedom to swim the same way he desired a chance with Nori. She swept past him once more, signing, "Come join us. You might actually be able to keep up with them." He grinned and let her tag him before racing after the beaming children and a smiling Nori. Perhaps he could wait a few more minutes before telling her she'd have to return alone. Chapter 3. Day always dawned late in the Coral Cove, something Gellin didn't mind when he was there for respite, but rising in the dark and surveying the coral reefs was an eerie task he wished to avoid. It left him grumpy as he exited his temporary chambers and swam through the quiet arches. When he reached the main entrance to the cove, he rested there a moment, remembering the way Nori's face had fallen when he'd told her he had to stay, the way she'd accused him of working when he'd promised not to, and the way he couldn't deny the truth of her words. He'd promised to make it up to her if she returned for a visit the next night, but she hadn't been willing to promise. Instead, she'd swum off with a family, still abiding by her parents' rules to never swim alone in this depth while shunning him all the same. It was always one step forward and 3 steps back with her. Had they ever really had a chance? Still, he couldn't help hoping she'd return tonight like he'd asked, enough that he'd reserved a private dining room. He'd even asked a friend if he and Nori could stop by to see their latest clutch of axolotls, since they were Nori's favorite amphibians. If she showed up, it probably still wouldn't be enough to get back in her good graces. His irritation abated as Eily came into view, her measured circles in the water evidence of her diligence through the night. He was certain no harm had come to the coral in her presence, but had she learned anything new? She chirped a greeting at his approach. He held out a hand, and she nosed it. "Nothing," was all she offered. Then she slid past him and used her body to bump his hip as she left. In the early days of their communication, he'd thought her abruptness was harsh, but now he understood it was simply her way. She'd be back again tonight, and every night until they'd gotten to the bottom of what had harmed the coral. He swam through the rows of every reef, admiring the skill of the protectors. Once they'd finished cleaning up the damaged coral, they'd have to breed and plant double this year, and probably the next 2 years, to help return the coral to its original numbers. As the protectors arrived, 2 at a time, still yawning in the bioluminescent glow, Gellin watched for Relafin. As he did, several of the protectors eyed him with concern, and was that fear? He supposed it was unavoidable when they all answered to managers who answered to him, but he wished they saw him as a friend or at least a benevolent leader. Maybe if he smiled more, the way Nori always advised him. As one couple swam past, he bared his teeth. It didn't feel as natural as when Nori made him laugh. Their startled expressions made it clear it didn't look natural either. He let his lips fall back to their solemn state. A tap on his shoulder brought him around, and Relafin treaded the water beside him. Despite Gellen's certainty that no other crops had been damaged, there was a weariness in the Protector's expression that put Gellen on edge. "What's wrong?" he signed. Relafin didn't answer, but led Gellen back to the damaged coral, floating past the replanted portions and pointing at ones still untouched. Gellen frowned, not sure why the man was showing him the same things he'd seen the day before. The Protector held out a hand in frustration, beckoning Gellen closer. Gellen leaned in toward the particular fingers of coral that Relafin was pointing out. The slices across their surfaces made Gellen gasp, a motion that felt more like choking in the water despite being able to breathe it with his gills. He slapped his scaled fingers on the other man's wrists, too impatient for water words. "What did this?" The man's words tumbled over each other in Gellen's mind as he fought his panic to be understood. "When we cleaned and replanted, we discovered these marks, their uniformity indicative of a trident or dagger, not the uneven tusks or claws of a sea creature. We still haven't found any clues as to who it was or why it was done, but we feel certain it wasn't an animal." Gellen's fingers had tightened around Relefin's wrist as he processed the other man's thoughts, but when Relafin winced, Gellen loosened his grip. "I don't want any other salines working this reef other than those who worked yesterday or during the night. Remind them of their promise to secrecy when they were sworn into this job. Remind them the lives of their family and children depend on their ability to hold their tongues. Until the culprit is found, everyone is a suspect, including those who worked this land." Relafin shuddered. "Perhaps especially those who worked it. Who else would have known? And who else would have had access?" Gellen hated the truth in the man's words, hated the need to acknowledge it and to begin his investigation with the very people he'd trusted to repair the coral they all protected. "I'll take guard myself tonight, but don't tell anyone else of my plans." He swore inwardly, thinking about the promise he'd made to Nori, another promise he would have to break. Chapter 4. Gellen hid amidst the kelp forest surrounding the reef. As coralline algae scraped the scales of his thigh, he wished, not for the first time, that his Starlock had given him somatic skills that allowed him to create illusions for hiding, rather than the noetic skills that allowed him to tune in to people's thoughts. He'd purposely removed all the other guards for this area, then hidden himself from view, hoping it would lure whoever damaged the coral to return. But after sitting amidst the kelp for hours, he wondered if he'd been a fool. His eyes drifted shut of their own accord, and when he jolted awake for the third time, he pulled out his trident and poked his arm hard enough to bring him back to an alert state. A faint flutter in the darkness made him freeze. He squinted, but it was probably a school of fish and nothing more. But then a ripple carried through the water, one that held the warmth of a creature intended not just for the sea. He peered farther around the seaweed and squinted once more. There, right next to the bed of coral bordering the one they'd replanted, orange scales sparkled as they reflected the surrounding bioluminescent plants. Rage tore through Gellen, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to ensure he could identify the culprit if he couldn't apprehend him alone, and that was assuming it was a single culprit. He slid from his place among the kelp, wincing as the coralline algae cut him several more times. With one final scrape, his tail came free. Staying low to the seafloor, he half-crawled, half-swam closer to the mysterious figure, who Gellen was now certain was a man. The murderer was so intent on his work, sawing at the coral fingers, that he remained hunched over his victim, oblivious to Gellen's presence, but also shielding his face from view. Gellen made a full circle around the coral bed in an attempt to identify the saline and to verify that the man was working alone. There was something familiar about him, making Gellen confident he belonged to the village of Tideholm, but he didn't know the man personally. Gellen pulled out his seaweed shackles, an item he'd been given to use at his discretion as guardian. All protectors of the coral had a set, just like the protectors of the people, but he'd never had reason to use them. The seaweed already had great strength, but these cuffs had been shellacked with a varnish made from coral dust and starblood. He offered the shackles up each week for the somatic protectors to imbue them with their strengthening skills, but he'd never actually had reason to use them before now. He hefted his trident in his other hand, as if measuring how it would feel to be forced to use it on one of his own. The thought didn't sit well with him, but he couldn't watch this man destroy the coral they revered. He swept forward, and the man stiffened, likely sensing his presence through the movement in the water, just before Gellen's trident touched his back. Gellen had no respect for this traitor's privacy, so he let his noetic magic tune in to the man's thoughts. Fear made the stranger's words practically shout. "We'll all die if I don't do this!" Gellen frowned and let his trident dig a little deeper against the man's ribs. The man raised his hands and dropped his dagger in surrender, but then his hands were flying in water words, signing the same words Gellen had heard in his thoughts. "We'll all die if I don't do this." Ignoring the way the words left him anxious, Gellen pulled the man's hands behind him, securing them with the seaweed shackles. Once the man was no longer a threat, Gellen placed his hand on the man's shoulder, feeding his own thoughts through. "Who are you, and why are you destroying the coral?" The man squirmed, turning to see Gellen, eyes wide with recognition that he was speaking with the Guardian. His thoughts began rolling over into Gellen's mind much faster, a willing confession. "My name is Murex. I'm protecting the people from the gemstones." Gellen scoffed, bubbles rising from his lips. "Why in Riston would we need protection from the gemstones? They keep us young and healthy." Murex's confidence wavered. "I don't know the details." Gellen dragged Murex through the water by his shackled arms, pushing his thoughts through the other man's scales. "Our role is to protect the coral, and you're killing it. You'll be brought before the elders to answer for your crimes." To his surprise, Murex nodded and made no effort to fight. Gellen guided Murex through the water, ignoring the other man's internal tirade until they reached a batch of guards. "Send word to Relefin," he instructed with water words. "We'll keep Murex in custody until the morning, and then transport him to the elders in Tideholm, where he'll be put on trial for his actions." Murex's thoughts grew louder, making Gellen wince. "We have to destroy all the gemstones. We can't let the coral produce anything more." Gellen grimaced at the other man's absurdity and returned one final thought. "You'll be sent to Lady Marinia for judgment if you can't acknowledge reality." As Gellen shoved Murex toward the guards, the traitor's thoughts still came at him like hail pelting his scales. "Yes, take me to the seer. She'll explain why the gemstones need to be destroyed. Then you'll see that I'm right." Even as the guards swam away with Murex, his cryptic words continued to pummel Gellen, leaving him unsettled. And after the distance grew too great for his noetic skills to tune in to Murex's thoughts, they still swarmed through Gellen's mind. The man's words couldn't be true. Gellen knew that. But something about Murex's urgency made it impossible for Gellen to let it go. Chapter 5. "I waited for you last night." Nori's sharp words brought Gellen out of his slumber. He rubbed his bleary eyes to take in her furious face scowling at him from above. Bright orange scales dotted her cheeks. "How did you—" He glanced around, surprised to find her in his small one-room home in Tideholm. Their people had no reason to lock doors, but how had she even known to find him here instead of in the Coral Cove? As he woke up a little more, he wondered if he should find it encouraging that she cared enough to seek him out. She shoved his arm, drawing his gaze back to her. "Why would I ever accept a marriage proposal from a man who can't even follow through on his word for a date?" Gellen's hopes came crashing back down. No, it was not a good sign that she'd barged into his home. He sat up. "I'm sorry, Nori. I fully intended to take you out last night, but something came up with work and I—" "Something always comes up with work." She balled her hands into fists, then began pacing the tiny space between his kitchen and bed. "It's exactly how it's been with my father all these years, leaving my mother and me to fend for ourselves. That's not the kind of life I want to have, not with you or anyone else." He sighed, unable to argue with her. It wasn't the kind of life he wanted either. But did that mean they weren't a good match, or that he wasn't fit to be an elder? Or did it mean there were flaws in the elder system, flaws they could help improve if he stepped into that role? Wait, how did you get back here if you were waiting for me in the cove last night? Fear shot through him at the thought of her swimming back alone during the night. "How did you get back?" She stopped pacing and crossed her arms over her chest, a few faint scales blooming on her cheeks with her irritation. "It's not the same, Nori, and you know it." "If it makes you feel better, I went to your room in the cove and you weren't there. So then I hunted for you for hours in every nook and cranny, and you were nowhere to be found. So then I swam as close to the farms as I dared." He sucked in a breath. "Nori." "I know I'm not supposed to be there, but I'm sick of being kept in the dark. I saw you leave. You headed straight for Tideholm when it was still the moon's reign. Why would you risk swimming back when the nightlife is out? What could be so important that you would make that trek alone?" "Apparently I wasn't alone if you were following me," he muttered. She rolled her eyes. He threw off his sheets and stood. "I have to meet with the elders today, and no, I can't tell you why." Maybe he could ask the elders for permission to fill her in on the status of the gemstones. If they were married, divulging those secrets would be allowed, but at this point, he didn't think she'd ever consider his proposal until he could regain her trust. "So that's it?" Her eyebrows raised. "You abandoned me during the night, and your only explanation is that you have to meet with the elders, so you still can't spend time with me today?" He couldn't keep the surprise out of his voice. "You want to spend time with me?" "Not now," she spit out. A bitter laugh escaped his lips as he hit a tipping point. "Then why should I bother trying to explain myself? I can't win with you, Nori." "Good. I'm glad we finally see eye to eye on that." She raised her chin and stormed out the front door. Gellin swore, and dark green scales bubbled up on his arms and legs. He didn't know how to make things right with her, not when he had to deal with the gemstones first. But something made him suspect he might never know how to make things right with her. When he reached Murex's home, the door opened after a single knock, and the older woman on the other side gave Gellin a serene smile. "How can I help you, Guardian?" "I'm looking for Murex." It wasn't a complete lie. He already knew Murex was being transported to the elders after the guards had swum him to shore this morning, but he was looking for information on Murex, which was almost the same thing. "He spent the week in the Coral Cove," the woman said. "He's needed a break. It's been stressful ever since his sister returned from Lady Marinia." Gellin's brow furrowed as he considered her words, and then they clicked. His sister? Is he Serventa's brother? She was the only person who had gone to see Lady Marinia in the last moon. "Yes," the woman's face brightened. "What an honor that you already know her. Have you spent time with Serventa?" A strange gleam entered her eye that often came when mothers tried to make a match of Gellin and their daughters. Despite knowing he was the guardian and next in line as an elder, few seemed aware of his promised state to Nori. "I know of her," he said firmly. "I heard her time with the seer left her distraught." The woman's face fell, and she glanced back in the house before lowering her voice. "It was hard on her. She spent most of her time in the barn out back, processing the seer's words. She won't speak of them, and until she does, I can't truly help her. But perhaps if someone like you showed an interest—" She let her words trail off as she eyed him. "You know how it is. Children don't want to speak with their parents about private matters." Gellin opened his mouth to refuse, but hesitated. Questioning the sister might help him get to the bottom of Murex's atrocious behavior. "You said she's in the barn out back?" The woman's smile widened. "Yes. She won't let me in, but maybe a handsome young man will get a different answer." Gellin held back a cringe and gave her a parting nod. Their home was on the outskirts of Tideholm, so instead of buildings lined up wall to wall, they had copious amounts of land and a view of the sea. With prime property like that, the family had to be wealthy, making Gellin wonder why he wasn't more familiar with them thanks to his father's position of power. They must have kept to themselves. Maybe they had the kind of private life Nori hoped for. As Gellin approached the barn, he grew nervous his sudden appearance would be unwelcome. But this was his job, his duty. A clanking noise came from within, like the woman was building something, or breaking it. He knocked on the shed door, receiving the immediate response of a high voice floating through the wall. "I want to be alone, Mother." "I'm not your mother," Gellin said. The clanking stopped. "Who are you?" "My name is Gellin, and I'm trying to track down your brother. I was hoping you might be able to help me." "My brother is a grown man and doesn't answer to me." Gellin laughed. She sounded far too much like Nori, and considering how well things went when he talked to her, he didn't anticipate this conversation going much better. "Your mother said he's been in the Coral Cove. Do you know why he went?" "Why does anyone go to the cove?" He sighed at her non-answer and resisted the impulse to bang his head against the barn door. "I'm worried your brother's in trouble, Serventa. I'm trying to help him." The silence that followed made him debate between giving up and storming inside, but then the door slid open, and a green eye peeked out. "What kind of trouble?" "I'm not at liberty to say." "He's a fool. I didn't even tell him anything. He doesn't know enough to take action." Her eyes were the same as Murex's, not just in color and appearance, but in the wildness they held. It made him suspect that whatever fervor had overtaken Murex had also overtaken her. Gellin's chest grew cold. Should he be all that surprised? She was the one who had come back from the seer, terrified of gemstones. How had he not made the connection sooner? "What did the seer tell you about the gemstones?" Gellin whispered. Fear flashed across her face, and she attempted to shut the door. He stuck his boot in the gap. Without remorse, he tuned in to her thoughts, not needing to go deep when his question had brought the answers to the surface so quickly. "We have to destroy them all before the woman comes across the barrier." His eyes narrowed. "What woman is coming across the barrier?" "No," she whimpered and backed away, placing her hands over her eyes. "There's so much blood, so much death." He slid the door open, and the sun's light poured in across the dirt floor. Dozens of gemstones lay on the ground. No, dozens of pieces of gemstones, their color and shimmering light bleeding out until they resembled mere glass. "What have you done?" Horror swept over him at the sight of them all, mangled and broken. "What are you using these for?" "I'm destroying them." Serventa picked up a mallet. "That way no one else can use them." She smashed another stone, making him shudder. Its color faded right before his eyes. "Please, Serventa." He held out both hands and took a step closer. "Let's talk about this. And then, if what you say is true, you can go back to destroying the gemstones with my blessing." The lie didn't even bother him, not when he was dealing with a woman left delusional from her time with the seer. She hesitated, mistrust in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope. "Are you guardian of the people or the gemstones?" The question caught him off guard, even though Nori's accusations had left it heavy on his mind. The Salines had protectors of the people, those who kept everyone in line whether on land or sea, and they had protectors of the coral and gemstones, those who bred, tended, and harvested the creatures. Because he oversaw the latter, he couldn't deny he was guardian of the gemstones, but wasn't it more than that? Why was he the only one who understood his care for gemstones was fueled by his care for the people? Why couldn't he be both? His hesitation cost him her trust. "You'll never listen to me!" She shoved past him, knocking him off balance. He ran after her, but she aimed for the water. It would be easy for her to lose him amidst the waves, and he needed to head back to the village center for Murex's trial. He returned to the barn and picked up the pieces of a broken gemstone. Really, both siblings should be on trial since she was destroying gemstones. With this new turn of events, he would insist they take Murex to the seer for judgment, even if Gellin had to take him there himself. Chapter 6. The trial lasted mere minutes, partly because of the broken gemstones Gellin brought, and partly because Murex invoked his right to request judgment from the seer. It made things far easier for Gellin, but it also left him unsettled. Why was the man so willing to take this to the seer? The seer couldn't possibly find him innocent after what he'd done. The uneasiness stayed with him during their swim to the island that held the seer's sanctuary. The traitor was all too eager to make his way to Lady Marinia, leaving the loose net Gellin transported him in more of a formality than a necessity. And now, as Gellin sat in the antechamber for Lady Marinia's quarters, his uneasiness grew tenfold. 4 acolytes stood equidistant around the perimeter of the chamber, studying him with an apprehensive curiosity. It didn't matter that platters of delicacies were set out on tables before him. Gellin was too uncomfortable to let his guard down, let alone eat. The scrape of boots on stone met his ears, and he turned to the hallway leading to the deepest cavern of the sanctuary, where Lady Marinia kept herself in solitary confinement. Gellin stood, eager for Murex to return and put this insanity behind them. But when Murex rounded the corner, his gaze held a new layer of horror that twisted Gellin's gut. The other man flung himself at Gellin, twisting Gellin's shirt in his fists. "A woman's coming!" he gasped out. The acolytes rushed forward, showing surprising strength in holding Murex back. "She comes for the gemstones!" If Gellin thought he was going to have to drag the information out of Murex's mind, he was mistaken. The man was desperate to share his vision, and when his panicked internal thoughts matched the words on his lips, Gellin knew his account could be trusted. "How many paths did she show you?" Gellin asked. 2. I saw 2, but a woman came in both. She came with a small army, asking for our gemstones. In one path we give them to her." Gellin scoffed. "We wouldn't hand them over to a stranger." Murex shook his head. "She gets them either way. In the other path, she takes them from the storehouse." Gellin froze. Murex shouldn't even know about the storehouse. The elders and Gellin were the only ones who knew where the gemstones were stored for safekeeping. They were the only ones who had keys to inventory and distribute the gemstones collected by the protectors. Would they be able to keep that information quiet now that Murex knew? And if Murex was right, if the seer was right, who would give that information up to a stranger demanding their gemstones? "She takes dozens, depleting our supply. Then she uses them against us." He shuddered, making Gellin realize Murex now knew all of the gemstone secrets. Cerventa likely did too. Gellin cocked his head. "In which path?" Murex blanched. "Both. In the first, when we hand them over, she uses them to threaten us, to weaken and subdue us. It's a slow genocide. In the second path, we rise up against her." "Good," Gellin said. "No!" Murex shook his head violently. "There's so much blood, so much death." Cerventa's words came back to Gellin, a terrifying echo of Murex's. "So we die either way?" Frustration leaked into his tone. "Fewer die when we let her take them, but in the end, there's still so much death, all by the hands of our precious gemstones." Murex spit the words out, his eyes flashing with terror once more. "My sister was right. We have to destroy them all. We can't let the woman use them against us. They're not for our benefit. They're for our destruction." Gellin squirmed under the man's intense gaze. This was why Cerventa had destroyed the gemstones. This was why Murex had been willing to kill the coral they revered on his sister's word alone. But even if it was true, how could they betray the coral? How could they destroy the gifts they received? If they took away the shimmering gemstones, they'd be taking away the people's health, safety, and longevity.
You're wrong,
Gellin murmured. The seer's prophecies are never wrong, the nearest acolyte pointed out, her own face reflecting the horror Gellin felt. Hers probably ran even deeper because her faith in the seer was absolute. If she's never wrong, then we can't stop it, not even by destroying the gemstones, Gellin said. A childlike whimper escaped Murex's lips. Then we're already dead, he whispered. Every single one of us. Chapter 7. Bringing the elders such valuable information should have felt rewarding, but Gellin hated having to relive Murex's revelation in their meeting room.
It will take time to deliberate all you've shared.
Elder Algean exchanged glances with the others. Gellin kept his face passive, but he wanted to roll his eyes. It was always that way with the elders, and then their decision would be final, regardless of any input anyone else wished to give. If he had anything more to say, now was the time to do it. But the entire swim back had felt fruitless. What could they possibly do to stop what was already destined to be?
Serventa was found soon after you left,
Elder Mishkel added.
We placed her in custody until you returned, but now we'll need to have Murex join her until we can determine our next steps. We don't want their words to get twisted into rumors that incite fear.
Their words wouldn't need to be twisted to cause panic, but Gellin knew better than to point that out to the elders. People had a way of hearing what they wanted and believing the worst, just like when they received visions from Lady Marinia. Not every outcome she showed carried death and destruction, but that was still what people latched onto. He stood a little straighter, his mind racing. Serventa and Murex had seen the worst in the vision, but what if there was more they hadn't seen? What if there were more gemstones they hadn't seen?
Until we've reached a decision, it will be prudent that you also keep this to yourself,
Elder Kraken pointed out.
And likely for many moons after.
Gellin barely heard him.
I'm sure you'll come up with the perfect solution for this unexpected threat, but I do have one more thing I'd like you to consider. A potential way to at least reduce the threat.
He held his breath, wondering if the elders would be willing to listen to one so young. In some ways, this was a test of how things would go when his father passed his role on to Gellin. How much would he need to fight to simply have the same power and authority the other elders took for granted? His father's face was like stone, forcing the others to decide without him. Gellin wasn't sure if he was grateful for what might be a vote of confidence from his father, or angry that his father wouldn't speak up for him even in this. His role had to be earned, but what would be enough to clinch it? After several hushed whispers, Elder Algean nodded.
Speak your thoughts, and we will take them into consideration.
A woman is coming to steal hundreds of gemstones, Gellin said slowly, letting the plan unfurl in his mind before leaving his lips. We can't stop that. Murex and Serventa believe the solution is to destroy them all. But what if we should do the opposite? What if we plant 3 times as many reefs and see if the coral produces 3 times as much? What if we leave the hundreds in the storehouse Murex saw, but we safeguard thousands for our defense in another? He pressed his lips together and held his breath, forcing himself to let the simplicity of his plan sink in. The elders exchanged surprised glances, but this time they seemed to converse with their eyes more than their lips.
And what if the woman comes tomorrow?
Elder Caranton asked. Then our fate is set anyway. But if she doesn't come for 6 moons, a year, maybe 2, we might be preventing our own genocide. The elder's lips settled in grim lines, making Gellin wonder if he'd gone too far. But then Elder Garrett nodded.
It seems prudent. Even if we come up with other solutions, there's no harm in building our supply, so long as we're not inevitably arming the woman intent on our demise.
Gellin returned the elder's nod.
It shall be done.
The elders bowed their heads together once more, Gellin all but forgotten. The subtle brush-off stung more than it should have. Gellin vowed to never be that sort of elder, to never be the kind of man Nori would be ashamed to claim as hers. He hesitated, remembering all the promises he'd been forced to break, all because of his inability to tell Nori the gemstone's secrets. Asking for yet another favor to be granted might be seen as misconduct, but he opened his mouth anyway.
You can go now.
His father's words were a warning as much as a dismissal.
We'll let you know if you can be of any more service in this newest revelation.
His gaze burrowed into Gellin's, and, as if he knew Gellin wanted to push back, he shook his head ever so slightly. Fine. Gellin would have to ask permission to tell Nori everything another day. Gellin surveyed the coral reefs with satisfaction one more time. Hundreds of tiny new gemstones winked their colorful light at him, the beds of coral shimmering so bright he was forced to squint. He signed his approval to Relafin, and the other man swam away, probably eager to continue his work without supervision. It had taken almost 3 months for Gellin's staff to adjust their breeding and harvesting schedules to plant more coral and increase the gemstone production. The coral even showed an eagerness to help produce more, as if they too were aware of what was to come. As long as the woman didn't arrive in the next few months, they would have enough gemstones to defend themselves. And if she waited a year or two, it could be that the blood Cerventa and Murex saw belonged to the woman's army instead of the Salines. The threat was still there, but now it was under control. Now he could rest easier knowing he'd done everything in his power to protect the people, the coral, and Nori. As he rounded the curve of the cove's coral fence, he practically swam into the very woman he was thinking about. The smile that had felt so unnatural with others came to his lips for her with ease. "You came." He signed the words instead of reaching for her arm. Without the elder's permission to speak of the gemstones, he had been slow to regain her trust. And while she'd agreed to meet him tonight for the date they'd missed all those moons ago, he was pretty sure she was in it for the baby axolotls, not him. Her smile was tight, but at least it was there. "My parents thought it would be nice for all of us to wait out the storm here." He glanced over her shoulder to where Elder Algean and Aquana watched with knowing smiles. It was no wonder Nori pushed Gellin away when her parents pushed her toward him. "I'm still glad you came, and the axolotls will be thrilled." This time her smile bloomed full force, making Gellin suck in water and nearly miss her water words. "Did you hear about Murex and Cerventa?" He stilled, afraid of what she might say. The siblings had been kept from the public eye until a couple of weeks ago, but Gellin had been under the impression they knew to keep their mouths shut. Had the elders been wrong? "They fled to Welk Bay. No one knows why they left, but I'm certain it has to do with what she learned from the seer." Gellin hesitated, relieved that they'd kept their silence, but uncertain how to respond. Anything he might tell Nori would only be a half-truth until the elders gave him permission to bring her into his confidence. "You know something." Nori's eyes narrowed in accusation as she signed. "And you know I can't tell you everything." He tried to soften the harsh words by slowing his hands, even though he knew it wouldn't help. She scowled. "And that's why things can't ever work between us." He had no argument, so he didn't bother trying. Nori lay back with her hands behind her head to stare up at the water's surface, the distant storm mere ripples from their view. Her fin fluttered just enough to hold her still, and Gellin longed to be at ease in the same way. It wasn't possible when he counted coral reefs in his mind's eye and calculated how many they'd need to outnumber the future thief's horde. "Maybe I should escape to Welk Bay too." Nori's water words put Gellin on edge, until he reminded himself she probably meant for them too. "What makes you think things will be better there? They have elders and rules, same as here." She snorted, making a bubble rise in the water. "That's true. Nothing exciting happens anywhere in Palin's waters. I'd have to cross a barrier like my aunt to experience something truly new." He frowned, wishing he could tell her about the destroyed coral, the stolen and broken gemstones, and his trip to the seer's sanctuary. Would it make her willing to stay? Or was she destined to swim free, to swim away from him? Nori bolted up straight, her gaze honed in on something in the distance. "Did you see that?" She fumbled her water words, then reached for his arm, her voluntary touch like an electric shock to his scales. She sent her thoughts to him in a rush. "I saw a flash of mauve and orange. I've only heard of one tale like that. And this is where Rhodocepha always returned, Father said." Gellin placed his other hand over hers. "It could be just a school of fish, Nori. In a storm like this, we see unusual creatures driven from their homes all the time. Besides, no one's seen Rhodocepha in years." She grinned at him as if he'd given her a challenge, then took off in the water, racing toward the storm they'd been instructed to avoid. Gellin wanted to call after her, but his voice wouldn't work in the water, and she was out of reach of his noetic skills. Her tail shimmered in the light brought by the storm's bolts above. Elder Algean raced after her, along with Aquana, his wife, both casting frustrated looks at Gellin, as if Gellin could keep Nori at bay. He shook his head, but as much as Nori's antics exhausted him, he didn't want to hold her back. Not really. She claimed to want excitement, but she was the one who made Selah Island exciting. She was all the excitement he needed. With a grin, Gellin followed the distant glimmer of the trail she'd left in the water. He'd keep chasing her until she felt the same.
I hope you enjoyed listening to The Light That Glimmers by Karyne Norton, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you enjoyed this story, you'll want to check out the Kickstarter featuring the series at karynnorton.com/Kickstarter. I'll have a direct link for it in the show notes. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Thank you all for checking out my Kickstarter and for listening to the podcast. Happy reading.